This meeting is being recorded.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
it means you're doing really well at this if you can make adjustments when something doesn't happen right.
Yeah, right. Well, as you heard, this meeting is being recorded. I apologize for last week. We just had an area wide. In other words, all of our campuses got together in Grand Island, hundreds of people, and it was an all-day meeting. And so I was unable to find some time aside to do this class, but we are moving through the book, and I hope we're going to talk about chapter 25. We still have some more people looking to get in. Oh, there's Lynn. Going to talk about chapter 25, and Will, you're still looking to get in, it looks like.
Well, get that one off.
Okay.
I'm in on my laptop. It's my phone, and I somehow didn't leave correctly.
Well, if you remember last time, we're looking at that period of time between Sukkot, which is the harvest festival in the Jewish calendar, and what we know as Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication. There's a period of about 6 to 8 weeks in between there, in which, if we're following along with our author and his thesis, that elaboration on Jesus the Messiah is going to have a place in the liturgy and in the readings and the teachings of the synagogue, because of course Matthew, the author of our New Testament text, attributed to Matthew, is writing primarily for a Jewish audience, and the context is in the synagogue itself. And I've just really I really appreciate this book. And so thank you, Mac, for suggesting it, because it really helps you read the New Testament in an absolutely different way. And of course, this is what Spong is trying to do. Whether we know it or not, we read it as Gentiles. We read it for information, right? It doesn't matter if you're reading Mark, Luke, or whatever gospel. We read for information. And in that kind of perspective, we tend to think that since we're reading for information, the information we get is coming from a literal source. And Spong repeats over and over again, boy, the Jews who were writing these stories, the Jews who were trying to develop an understanding of Jesus as the Messiah, they were not writing history. They were not trying to write these narratives to be understood literally. So when we look at the story of the Canaanite woman, for example, who comes to Jesus asking for healing for her daughter, it's not essential for us to understand that this was a story that actually happened. What is essential is to place it in the context that we're reading. Jewish followers of Jesus struggling with the idea that, this Messiah is not just a Messiah for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles as well. And this is the outcome of the story of this Canaanite woman, and not just an ethnic understanding. She's a woman from Cana, from Canaan, I should say, with all of the negative connotations that go along with that. But she's also seen as somebody who's kind of dirty and on the outside. So there are so many strikes against her. And she, even in her persistence, is able to convince Jesus that, that the healing of her child is so important, and he heals the child. And this is where we left off last time. And Spong says, we've dealt with Canaanites, quote unquote, throughout the history of the church. And the Canaanite woman is not a person of history, but an eternal symbol, always standing before the human conscience, challenging its limits, demanding to be heard. And she will not go away until she's embraced. Her face will change throughout history, but her demands will remain constantly challenging our security and eroding our barriers. So if I can use the metaphor, opening the doors to the synagogue, so to speak, that others may come in, that others may be invited in. This is the challenge of the new Messiah. So that's where we were last time. And Spong talks about, a couple of different stories that happen in the interlude between Sukkot and the Feast of Dedication. And it's the Feast of Dedication that I want to move on to. Are there any questions or comments about what we have just been referring to, the Canaanite woman, Peter failing to walk on water, the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000? Yeah. If not, then we're going to look at part 7 in our book, and I can't remember what pages we're on right now, but somewhere close to page 259. So we're almost finished with this book. We've got maybe 100 pages or so to go. So I'd like you to begin thinking about where you would like to move next. If you have a particular book that you've heard about that you'd be, willing to offer up to everybody. We have some time yet, and most likely a couple months the way we go. But we will be looking for another book as we move forward. So let's talk about a feast that's referred to in Scripture as the Feast of Dedication. And it's going to be really important for us to know the historical background of this feast, because it's not something that is found in the Hebrew Bible, so to speak. It is not one of those feast days that are established, in the books of Moses, unlike, Passover and Shavuot and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah. All of those that we've been looking at have a biblical foundation. This feast, this Jewish holy day, has a historical beginning that is closer to the time of Jesus than those previous than the time of Moses, of course. So whereas Moses probably lived around 1250 and BCE, and then we can probably date the Exodus from Egypt somewhere around that time. Now we're going to look at an event that was clear in the memories, or at least in the historical memory of the people of Judah, and that had to do with the Maccabean revolt. But before we get into that, there is something that, this Feast of Dedication is something that we know of as Hanukkah. And I wanted to give you, I guess, a little object lesson on Hanukkah and how the menorah plays into that. But let me first say that what Spong is going to do is he's going to connect this celebration of Hanukkah, also known as the Feast of Dedication, with the Transfiguration, which is found in chapter 17 of Matthew. And boy, for me, all of this just came right home and hit me right in the face when I read this. And I thought, why? I think I had intuited something about this connection in the past, but why didn't I see this so clearly before? And this is why, Spong's book is so important. But when we think about Judaism, we often think about the menorah. And students have asked me this, because sometimes when you refer to the menorah, it has, 7 it's a candelabra with, 7 arms to it. But when we look at Hanukkah, there is a different candelabrum that's still referred to as the menorah, but technically it should be called the Hanukkah, and it has 9 arms to it. And so what's the difference here? Well, this menorah on the left would be known as the temple menorah and would have been present in the temple well before the time that Hanukkah was established as a holiday. Anybody want to guess why there are 7 arms?
Days of the week?
Or days of creation. You might remember in Genesis, when God says, let there be light. And so in creation, light comes into the world in over the period of 7 days. And so this number 7 was understood to be the perfect number and, representative of God's good creation, is symbolically, manifest in this menorah of 7 arms. But when Hanukkah comes to be established as a day of observance, and we'll get into the history of that celebration or that observance takes place over a period of 8 days. And we'll soon talk about why this is the case. And so you will sometimes see a menorah that has 8 or actually 9 candles. There's a candle lit on each day of Hanukkah by this candle in the middle called the servant candle. And so this is another indication of God's presence in the world. So the symbolic idea of light coming into the world. And remember where we are as well. We're in the northern hemisphere. Hanukkah is celebrated, historically, this matches up with one of the darkest, one of the symbolically darkest months of the year, or experiences of the year for the Jews during the 2nd century BC, as well as the darkest, literally, month of the year, December. This is why I've always thought it would be so difficult to celebrate Christianity or to observe Christianity in the Southern Hemisphere, in Australia or in New Zealand, because Christmas and the Advent, the coming of light into the world, happens at a time when there's plenty of light. If you're in Australia, right? Or in New Zealand, you're on the other side of the equator. And this goes back to a solstice festival that was common in many traditions around the world. I mean, you can go up into the British Isles and find, and even though it comes much later, but if you go to New Mexico and see the remains of Chaco Canyon, the idea of the solstice festival or the solstice observance, very, very important to indigenous peoples around the world. And this is kind of interesting because Jews up to this point, and let's talk about we're now thinking about the period of history between the destruction of the first temple and then the coming of Jesus. So there's about a 500-year period of time, 500 BC all the way up to the time of Jesus and afterwards. But during the first temple period, Jews were always very, and I shouldn't call them Jews, the Israelites, people of Judah, were very, very suspicious of pagan rituals. I mean, my goodness, there was a Canaanite ritual where children were actually sacrificed to a god by the name of Mot. And so, these pagan agricultural rituals were seen as, not only hedonistic, but also idolatrous. You shall have no other gods before me. But nevertheless, there is something intuitively proper about calling the sun back from its, I guess it's a nadir, the zenith nadir of its, decline, and trying to coax the sun coming back. I mean, we think about Roman and Greek myths about how this happens, but the Jews wanted nothing to do with that. So it is ironic that around 175 to 165 or so, during this Maccabean revolt, when Hanukkah does come to be celebrated, it happens to fall almost smack dab on the date of a solstice celebration, right? And so they have their solstice ritual after all, but it's not in any way connected with agriculture. I think I think Jews would say it's a coincidence that it happened that way, that the historical events that Hanukkah commemorates happened precisely at the time of solstice rituals. So anyway, we are in chapter 4, and we're going to be looking at this Feast of Dedication. I want to talk about the historical roots of this. But let me stop. Are there any questions or comments about this, about the two menorahs, by the way? This, by the way, this menorah on the left, the temple menorah, would become a taunting symbol that the Romans would use against the Jews in 70 of the Common Era when they destroyed the Second Temple. Let me show you an image here if I can find it. Have any of you seen this image before? This is on an arch in Rome called the Arch of Titus, and it commemorates the destruction of the Jewish temple, and many Jews were taken away as slaves into Rome, as well as the booty from the temple. And of course, you can see the menorah here being, one of the treasures that were taken from the temple when it was destroyed. But that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Eventually, we're going to talk about the importance of the destruction of that Second Temple. So let's put ourselves historically in context. The First Temple was destroyed in 587. The people of Judah were taken away to Babylon for a period of about 50 years. They were allowed to return in 539. And from that time onward, they began building their Second Temple because, they were Jews. There were the books of Moses talked about sacrificing to God as the proper way to worship, and they could not do that without a temple. So under the care of Cyrus and Darius, the kings of Persia, they were given protection to go back to Jerusalem and build their temple. And this is a period of time in the Bible that is reflected in Ezra and Nehemiah and in 3rd Isaiah, the last 10 or so chapters of Isaiah, and in the prophet Zechariah and Haggai, if I'm not mistaken, a time period that we don't often deal with in Christian worship. But let's talk about what happened at that time. There were a series of rulers that the Jews, as they were being called in Babylon, found themselves under when they were rebuilding their temple. It was Cyrus of Persia, but then eventually Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era would conquer Jerusalem, and he would begin a process of Hellenization, trying to make the Jews speak Greek and recognize Greek myths and establish Greek art throughout Alexander's empire. And when Alexander dies, this is carried out by a series of generals, really, who ended up basically fighting among themselves. But the ones that we need to concern ourselves with is a group known as the Seleucids, who ruled out of Damascus, Syria in 175 of the Common Era. And one of these Seleucid, he was a king by this time, he was known as Antiochus the Fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes because he saw himself as, a manifestation of God. That's really what Epiphanes means. I'm Antiochus, the son of God. Well, if you're the son of God and you are now ruling an empire that has this temple down in Jerusalem where they don't worship God, it's a very, very big they don't worship you as God, I should say. They worship their one God. It's a very, very huge temptation to go down and set them right, so to speak, right? Those darn Jews, we're going to teach them, who's in power here. So this is what Antiochus does. He goes down in the year 169 BCE. And of course, at this time, he's also trying to overpower and take over Egypt, which ends up eventually being his demise. But when he comes to Jerusalem, he starts a very, very serious and rigorous Hellenization campaign. And a lot of it focused around the temple. We're going to take all of your, references to God out of the temple, and we're going to put up images of our deities. And most especially, we are going to expect you to worship Antiochus Epiphanes, the old story that happens here. Worst of all, Antiochus goes into the Holy of Holies. If you might remember what the Holy of Holies is, it's a place that during Yom Kippur, the high priest goes and asks for atonement from God. It can only be accessed by the high priest and on one day of the year. It is the seat of the presence of God. So imagine how the Jews react when Antiochus goes in there and offers up an offering on the altar. Some say it was, there are various stories as to what happens, how this happened, but some say it was a pig that he actually sacrificed on the altar, which is, adding insult to injury. So this is what this reference refers to here. You obviously, this is from the Middle Ages, and this what was known as the abomination of desolation, the sacrifice on the altar that Antiochus performed, and then the Jews having to bow down and give their obedience and obeisance to Antiochus. This is what this image depicts. Well, there were some Jews who are okay with this. Hey, that's great. Whatever's going to put us in, in the good graces of our captors or of our overlords, we're all about this. So this is where a split really begins to happen in Judaism. There are going to be Jews who are known as Hellenized Jews, who read Greek, who read Greek philosophy, who co-opt themselves, you might say, into Greek civilization, some to the point of not, just giving up on Judaism altogether and not becoming circumcised or not circumcising their children. Now we'll be Greeks, right? But others are going to say, and these are the ones who were established in Jerusalem, no way, we've got to do something about this. And it was at this point, a man by the name of Mattathias and his son Judas started carrying out guerrilla raids, guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid soldiers that were in Jerusalem, which raises, and they were so effective at what they were doing that Judas, the son of Mattathias, this great general, his descent upon some of these Greek soldiers was so overwhelming that he came to be known as the Hammer, hammering down his enemy, which raises a really interesting observation that we've got. We tend to think of terrorists as nothing but evil and dirty players and things like that. But one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And that's precisely what happened here. These guys aren't terrorists to the Jews, they're freedom fighters, right? But to Antiochus Epiphanes, they are terrorists, okay? And they're so effective that eventually they are able to wrest control of Jerusalem out of the hands of Antiochus, and they make a compromise, a treaty between the Seleucids and themselves, and thus begins a 100-year dynasty of Jewish rule in Jerusalem known as the Hasmonean dynasty, but we don't often talk about very much. But there's a transition that takes place between the Seleucids being in power and the Maccabeans being in power. And I'm going to stop because I've been going on quite a real, tear right here. Are there any questions about this so far? This is such an important part of the class I would usually teach in the New Testament that I've taught for so many, 25 years at least, that I can't remember how much of this history I knew before I started teaching these classes. Usually we pick up in the first century, but this is foundational to who Jesus is, really. This whole Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty that follows afterwards. Are there any questions or points of clarification I can make? All right. Well, in the handing over the keys of the city, so to speak, there's one thing that just had to happen, and that was the Jews needed to go back into the temple and to rededicate it, or to dedicate it once again to God, clear out all the pagan riffraff, but also to purify it, right? And if you know how that second temple was built before Herod, there were no windows in the Holy of Holies or in the place where the bread of the presence is. And this is legend, right? This is where the whole Festival of Lights comes from. And they didn't have light inside to be able to do all the work that needed to be done. It took them eventually 8 days, but how were they going to do this when there was no light? And so they gathered enough oil for a day to light the oil lamp so that they could go into the temple and cleanse it of all its impurities. Well, miraculously, guess how long the oil burned? 8 days. The oil burned 8 days, and so this is why we have the 8 arms on the Hanukkah, and why this Festival of Light in the Jewish tradition is celebrated for 8 days. By the way, this story can be read in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, actually, which is in the Apocrypha, which is not in the Protestant Bible, but is in the Catholic Bible. So all of the holy places, not just the temple, but around Jerusalem itself, where altars were set up, were cleansed and rededicated to God. And the symbolism here is of God's light returning to the temple, God's presence returning to the temple. And in order, because this is such a monumental, watershed event, it was determined that every year at this time, it should be celebrated, it should be observed. But in the observation of this time, they needed, as Jews do, this is actually what Matthew is doing. They needed to create a liturgy to inform the people and make the story more meaningful. This observance was going to last for 8 days. So they had to reach back into their, history of the Hebrew Bible and draw on symbolic imagery that would lend a sense of meaning to this light returning to the temple. And this deep dive into their history turned out to be not that big of a deal, because if they look back, and this was not manipulated, this was this imagery of God's light in the temple, you could kind of walk it back all the way to the time of Moses. First in Ezra, the book of Ezra, when the second temple is built and the Shekinah, which is the presence of God, returns to the temple. That is observed in Ezra in, I can't remember what chapter that is. I think it's Ezra 8. I may be wrong on that one. I'm not good on numbers. So, but just as in the building of the second temple, the Shekinah returns, so in the rededication of the temple, the Shekinah, the presence of God, returns. But walking back further, they saw that the light came into the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon builds the first temple. And then if they keep walking it back all the way to the time of their sojourn in the desert, God's presence was there in the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where the slaves who had just escaped from Egypt would come into the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And then they could walk it all the way back to the giving of the law on Sinai, giving it of that to the people through Moses. You might remember the story when Moses goes up in Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. They're both the same thing. A second time, and God gives him the tablets. When Moses returns, his light, his face shone with the light of God. It's almost like God gave him a sunburn or something, right? So this light is a thread that, that winds its way through the 1,200-year history, or by this time 1,000-year history, all the way up to the temple being rededicated. So in 164, I think is when this happens, 164 BCE, when the first Hanukkah takes place, when the lamps burn. Thereafter, the liturgy was going to draw on all of these previous circumstances where God's light returned to the temple. And then finally, there's one of these places that Spong refers to, and that is the priest Joshua. And this is going to be important for the later transfiguration story. But the prophet Zechariah has several visions. And one of these visions involves a priest by the name of Joshua, who in the story itself is able to rebuke Satan. Interestingly, this is only the second time in the Old Testament where the word Satan or the character Satan appears. But he appears before an angel in dirty clothes, but to symbolically affirm, oh, there's Denny, but to symbolically affirm, the priest's legitimacy. His clothes are turned from dirty to shining white. They're completely renewed. It sounds like a great, laundry detergent commercial. But, in Zechariah, it's just kind of a one-off incident, but it's really important as we begin to look forward to the transfiguration, because when Peter, James, and John accompany Jesus to the top of the mountain, Mount Tabor, Jesus, his clothes are going to shine in this vibrant white as well. So all of these references to this light returning, or light presence of God coming to the people, are going to be drawn upon in the story of the Transfiguration, as well as the mysterious departure of Moses and Elijah. If you know about those two, we never hear that Moses dies, and the legend had developed that he was taken up into heaven by God, and the same with Elijah. And so these two people represent the law and the prophets. Moses, the bringer of the law, and then Elijah, the father of the prophets. And they are going to be present in this transfiguration story that we are now about to turn to. So let's talk about, we're right at the end of chapter 24 now. Let's talk about the Feast of Dedication and see if there are any questions about this. This is the feast that's celebrated still to this day, and it's known as a rabbinic holiday because it wasn't established in the Hebrew Bible, but during the time of the rabbinic period. Any questions or comments about this?
Dan, one of the things that fascinated me was the conversation he had just very briefly about the name Joshua.
Yep.
And the fact that Matthew or whomever decided it would be Jesus at some point.
Yep.
And that it normally, was it Aramaic, would have been Joshua.
In Hebrew, it was Yahshua.
Hebrew. Yeah.
And then Aramaic, it was Yeshua. And then we anglicized it with Jesus, but Jesus followers would have known him as Yeshua. And it means God is our salvation. And if you know the story of Joshua this is really interesting. The story of Joshua in, the book of Joshua, he is the one who takes the mantle from Moses and brings the people into the land across the Jordan River, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land where they would no longer be slaves, but would be the people of God, no longer wanderers, but settled in their place, right? They achieved their salvation. And so in many ways, Jesus is the one who takes them through the Jordan, through baptism into the kingdom of God. So that question is also, or that statement about who Jesus is also very important. Yeshua in Aramaic. So
it makes me think that if we had kept it as Joshua, it would have changed our perspective throughout history on who Jesus was.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And our change of the name does not, when we call Jesus, you can see that the consonants are the same, but it doesn't make a direct link all the way back to the Hebrew Bible and the Joshua who fit the battle of Jericho, which I think is symbolic of what Spong is trying to say. We've gentrified, if I can use that term. We've made the story very, very Gentile in its perspective, and almost, not almost, we've just ignored the entire Hebrew Bible as being foundational to understanding who Jesus is. And while I've known that for quite some time, this book has made it all the more obvious to me, just by talking about how this the Gospel of Matthew is in fact a liturgy that is that tries to see Jesus, or it tries to impress upon the followers of Jesus how he is the new Moses, not somebody superseding Moses, but I guess there is some of that, but he is Moses, Elijah, and David all, rolled into one, priest, prophet, and king all together. So, which brings us to, Matthew's story of the three wise men who bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of those symbolic, not a historical event, but to Jews who hear about others coming, Gentiles coming, and not just, Gentiles, but people of status and stature, and bringing particular gifts. Gold, representative of the kingship of Jesus. Frankincense, the incense that's burned in the temple, representative of Jesus' priestly character. And then the myrrh, which is an embalming spice, representative of his prophetic role, and also, suggestive, a premonition of his death, his sacrificial death. So, any other comments? Thank you, Joy. No, that was Sharon, it wasn't Joyce. Sure to unmute if you have a comment, because sometimes I see people's lips moving. And well, let's you all probably know that the temple was destroyed. This temple that was rededicated in 164 BC was in around 35 BC, was under King Herod, was refurbished, and I've shown you images of what that temple looked like. He really made it one of the great architectural wonders of the world. And this would have been finished about the time of, that Jesus was a young boy. if not later. But it was a huge project that took a lot of person power and took a lot of, Jewish tax money as well. But there were Jews in Jerusalem who were just never satisfied with the fact that there were Romans who were occupying their holy land. This is their land flowing with milk and honey, after all, right? And remember also, there were Jews in Jerusalem who were hearing stories, think about the stories we hear of the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere's Ride, and the Boston Tea Party, and the battles of Concord, or all of those stories where we are wresting our freedom from the overlord of King George, right? Well, that was about the same amount of time that passed between the Maccabean revolt and the time of Jesus, and about 250 years or so. So these Jews were still hearing stories about people like Judas Maccabeus and the guerrilla warfare that he was able to carry, that was able to free Jerusalem and Judah from their Seleucid overlords. So inspired by that same kind of patriotism, dare I use the word, they continued to carry out guerrilla attacks against Romans. And these were folks who, we know of in the New Testament as zealots. Their zeal for the law was such that they wanted to purify the Second Temple of its Roman presence. That all went well and good for a while, until finally the Romans just said, okay, we've had enough. We're going to send, our troops into Jerusalem. And basically they just utterly destroyed the city. And took away people as slaves, destroyed the temple. There are stories told of children being thrown up into the air and being caught on the end of spear points. They just completely obliterated the city of Jerusalem. And the temple being probably the most symbolic prize to be destroyed. That happened in 70 of the Common Era. There was a revolt that happened around 66. 4 years later, the temple was gone. Okay, now think about what that does to you. If you are Jewish and for 2,000 years, the temple has been the center of your identity. And think about what that does to followers of Jesus who are going to the synagogue and hearing about this new Messiah. And then a question is being raised. I wonder if we really need the temple at all, because, with the new Messiah, maybe a new day has dawned. And so thus begins a split between Jews, especially the more Orthodox Jews, who believe that the only way you can truly worship God is in the temple, and those who, as Spong says, are being called revisionists. We don't need a temple, right? So if you don't need a temple, yet the temple is so important to worship and to meeting God in, face to face, as Moses did, and coming into God's presence, then how are we as revisionists, as followers of Jesus, supposed to understand, this lack of a temple? And this is the place where we open with chapter 25, the story of the Transfiguration. The story of the Transfiguration would have been told in the Jewish synagogue during the Feast of Dedication, where the rededication of the temple was being commemorated and observed, those 8 days of light, the coming of light into the world. But remember, when Matthew's people are celebrating it, it's well after the destruction of the temple. So where is the light now? Well, some were saying, well, we need to rebuild a temple. We need to find a place where, and there are still Jews that are saying that yet today, and it's creating all kinds of problems in Israel. The more so as we move forward. Eventually what's going to happen, Rabbinic Judaism is going to kind of move away from that idea of temple worship. But the revisionists are going to say, we have to understand Jesus in light of, we have to understand Jesus in light of this lack of a temple. When the temple is destroyed, how do we worship? How can God's light return to the temple that has been utterly destroyed? Well, guess how? The light is going to be returning to a new temple, who is the person of Jesus. So in this conflict between the Orthodox Jews and the revisionists, some of the revisionists were saying, hey, look, because you guys you didn't understand who the Messiah was, then God came and destroyed the temple to try to make it all the clearer that, hey, you don't need the temple anymore. And so they were starting to talk to the Orthodox Jews and say, you denied the Messiah, and now God has destroyed the temple through the Romans, and now you're left with only the option of seeing the Messiah. Well, there was some Messiah as he is, Jesus. Well, there were many Jews who just did not want to see that. And thus begins the split that we see, especially in the Gospel of John, where Jews in the synagogue are chasing or are rebuking and chasing out of the synagogue the followers of Jesus, because they were trying to promote this idea of Jesus as the new Messiah, Jesus as the new temple, if you will, and they were not going to buy it. So some questions about that. I want to talk about the transfiguration, but I want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody. Yes, question? Well, the story of the transfiguration occurs in Mark, and it occurs in Matthew as well. It does not occur in the Gospel of John, which is very, very interesting. And I can't remember if it occurs in Luke. But our emphasis here is, remember, Matthew is using Mark as he's writing his new version of the gospel. And the story goes that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, represented here at the bottom of the icon, up to Mount Tabor. And while he's there, he's enveloped in this cloud. And when the cloud, disperses, Jesus is bathed in light. And of course, this is what this image is in the icon of this halo around Jesus. And in the midst of this, we see Moses on Jesus' right hand, the father of the law, and then Elijah on Jesus' left hand, the father of the prophets. And this symbolically, and remember what Spong wants to say, this didn't happen literally. This is a story that is going to explain the transition from a temple that's been destroyed to a temple that's been, quote unquote, rebuilt. Here is every affirmation that you could possibly need, right? The presence of God coming into Jesus, his garments shining with light, just as the garments of Joshua and Zechariah 3 shone with light. Moses, the bringer of the law, or the person who brings the law from God to the people of Israel, and Elijah, the two pillars. Spong calls them the twin towers of Judaism, giving their, if you will, their stamp of approval, so to speak, on Jesus. But this light coming to Jesus is a substitute now, or is I shouldn't say a substitute, it is it's a supersession of that light that came to the tent of meeting, that came to the first temple, that came to the second temple and its rededication. Now that that temple's gone, the light has come into Jesus. And this is what Matthew wants to get across to his readers. And this story would have been read precisely during the the Festival of Lights. And Jewish followers of Jesus would have understood it as a way of celebrating Hanukkah, if you will, in a new way. And in some ways, we do this as well at Advent. We talk about the light that is coming into the world, right? That is going to come into the world with the birth of Jesus. In all of its simplicity, a child born in a manger, to whom kings and even shepherds, the high and the low, bring their gifts and their obedience and their I shouldn't say obedience, bring their reverence. A new dimension of reality has entered the world. So in many ways, Hanukkah, from this Jewish perspective, even though it's kind of a historical holiday in Judaism, Christians, if I'm reading Spong correctly, Christians would do well to celebrate Hanukkah, celebrate the new dimension of Hanukkah, this light that comes into the world in the new temple of Jesus. And I just, again, I'm just so pleased with this book because I did not see this from a Jewish perspective. And of course, we never would, because we're all taught to read like Gentiles. Oh, this is a story that happened. And as Spong says, this is ludicrous if you want to try to read this literally, right? But if you want to read it symbolically, boy, look at the doors that it opens. Look at how rich the story becomes in the emerging of this new understanding of who Jesus of Nazareth is as the long expected Messiah. He is God's presence. He is the light of God present in the world. Remember the Holy of Holies in the temple? There's the Holy of Holies right there, dressed in priestly, shining white, pure garments. And you need nothing else. Moses and Elijah will affirm this for us. It's beautiful. It's really a turning point. And in Mark's gospel, it is almost the smack dab center of his gospel. And Matthew, it's a little bit, we're almost 2/3 of the way through it, but it is symbolically a turning point in Matthew's gospel. Any comments about this?
Just briefly, Dan, I think you hit it right on the head. But in addition to Spong saying that this is nonsensical, to me, the key thing, which is the key to his whole thesis, is just the sentence that says, no faithful Jew would ever have been tempted to do that. In other words,
Yeah.
to consider it literally.
Right,
That's his
right.
deal.
Yep, it sure is. And we, of course, those Jews who would be reading this symbolically and so beautifully, let me add, they were going to be shunned by 150. They were going to be shunned by a much more Gentile-oriented church that would have been influenced by the Hellenized Jew, Paul. Remember, we were talking about the Hellenization under Alexander the Great and the Seleucids. Paul is a descendant of that Hellenization. And so that Hellenized approach to the world was going to supplant almost completely this very Jewish understanding of the Gospels. So, well, when we come back, our time is almost upon us. I guess we are going to be reading chapter, we're going to start, we just finished chapter 25, excuse me. And then we'll start on part 8, the journey toward Passover. And I'm anxious to see how this temple metaphor, Jesus as the new temple, is carried out from here on out, because as we move into the next 3 months, we're going to see the move from Hanukkah to Passover. And so it should be fun. And I hope you're still enjoying this. So it's a real simple and easy book to read. For some reason, I don't know how many sessions we've had on this, at least 30. And I hope we're not spending too much time on it, but I really am so grateful that we started reading this book. I'm enjoying it immensely. Any final comments? If not, then I'm going to stop our share, and we will see you all next time. And please, if you have friends who are interested in this kind of thing, they're welcome to join us. Like the Jewish followers of Jesus, we shouldn't really be that exclusive, right? Let's open the doors of the synagogue and let some of the Canaanites in. So anyway, I'll talk to you all later. Okay. Thank you. See you next week.
Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan.